Welcome everyone. I think I've just gone live on YouTube, and yeah, today I'll be talking about the Stonewall Dutch. I think it's a very interesting structure mainly. The Dutch relates to the opening 1d4 f5, but I'm mainly going to be talking about a specific structure, not about a specific opening today. And it's also connected to kind of specific moves. You cannot always play the Stonewall Dutch. You cannot, for example, always play the Dutch. After 1e4, you're not really allowed to do it. So it's mainly connected towards 1d4 openings. But you can play the Dutch basically against any other move except for 1e4. Against 1c4 you can also do it, and against 1 knight f3 also very much possible. So the only move we cannot really play the Stonewall against is 1e4. The reason for that is because he already attacks these two squares, and those are two squares that we actually want to put our pawns on. So we cannot really do that. So it's mainly a 1d4 structure. And let's get right into it. So we play 1 f5, which is the Dutch. Typical move is, and yeah, actually this is already kind of an offbeat opening. It's not so uncommon, but it's definitely not one of the main responses against 1d4 and 1c4 and 1 knight f3. That is because it probably doesn't have too good of a reputation. In general, I think the main status after 1 f5 is that white is supposed to be better. The thing, however, is though that because it's not so often played, white is not too familiar with these positions. He might not be up to date in his theory, and that very often makes up for you playing a not so great move. So it's not too big of a deal that we're not playing the best move at the very start. More common is either 1 knight f6 or 1 d5. But what I'm going to be showing today is actually that the Stonewall structure. So let's get into the Stonewall structure. So first few moves, and yeah, this is exactly the Stonewall structure. So the pawns need to be on f5, e6, and d5. Usually the pawn will also go to c6 to support its center. But you could also leave the pawn on c7 for the moment, that's also fine. And this is the typical Stonewall structure. There's not, and the reason why it's called the Stonewall is because it's basically like a wall. It's very hard to break through. All of the pawns are protecting each other. It's not so easy to attack. White puts a little bit of pressure on it with the pawn on c4. But whenever he takes on c4, we simply capture back with a pawn. And it's simply very, very difficult for white to get rid of this d5 pawn. So we have a structure that's very hard to get rid of. But on the other end, there are of course also some things which are not ideal in our structure. We've already put all of our center pawns on the light squares. By putting all of our pawns on the light squares, it means that we've weakened our dark squares a lot. So what you will very often see in these Stonewall structures is that the squares e5 and f4 especially will often get weak. You can, for example, already see that this knight from f3 can jump into this square, and it will not be contested with any pawn. It cannot be attacked with the d pawn, it cannot be attacked with the f pawn, which means that it's hard to get rid of this knight on e5. I have seen the YouTube channel of Anisha, I've even been there. But let's go back. So there are some benefits to this structure, but there are definitely also weaknesses. In general, objectively speaking, I would say that this structure is considered to be better for white. But the thing is that it's not that easy to play. Black has a lot of options in general on how to play such a position. And you will easily get your opponent out of book in these positions. After which it's just the both of you playing. And I know that in general, a lot of white players aren't too comfortable in these positions, because it's simply not so easy to get the right plan. But first we start to go into plans. Let's talk a bit about the pieces. So we've already seen the structure. In general, not too much will change about our structure, so we should mainly talk about the pieces actually. And one thing should be clear the moment you see this pawn structure is that this dark squared bishop is your good bishop, and this light squared bishop is your bad bishop. Because simply right now you can see that this bishop is not very active, while this bishop already has a lot of choices. And that is because the pawns are in the light squares. So one thing you will very often, for example, see is that white is trying to get rid of the dark squared bishop and eventually leave us with the light squared bishop. So one typical plan, for example, is to go b3 followed by bishop a3 to try and exchange off this bishop and get rid of it, after which we are left with this more or less bad light squared bishop. It's not the end of the world if we lose the dark squared bishop, but it's definitely something which we should be trying to avoid. So that's already one of the main plans for white. I think the other minor pieces are not that too important. It's not like there's a bad knight or a good knight. I think though that one thing black should be aiming for is in general to try and exchange pieces. We should not try to exchange the dark squared bishop, but we would be okay with all the minor pieces being traded off, for example. Part of that is because we have it feels like at least we have slightly less space. White has two pawns more or less in the center, while we only have one pawn in the center, if we compare it to white's position. So white has a slightly more space, which means that we should be okay with exchanging minor pieces. However, how do we ever get rid of this light squared bishop? Well, one plan, which we will get into later on, is to get this bishop from d7 to e8 to h5. And suddenly we have maneuvered our bishop to a much more active square. On this square it will contest this knight, it will put pressure on the pawn and on the queen. So there's a lot of stuff going on this diagonal. And that's one of the main typical plans to exchange of this bishop, or at least make it more active if it doesn't get exchanged. And another plan I would say is to play b6, maybe even b5, and then put this bishop on b7 or a6. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of pressure on this diagonal, so it would make sense as well to put it on b7. Maybe eventually we can push for a c5 break, so it does make a lot of sense as well to put it on b7. And on the other end, it would be very active as well if we put it on a6, because on a6 it puts pressure on c4. But on the other end, it also puts pressure on e2 and even on f1, because there's likely going to be a rook on f1 pretty soon after white castles kingside. So very often white will, for example, play castle kingside here. Why d4 not bishop e7 first? No, I wasn't assigned this opening because of my nationality. It's slightly random. Actually, one thing my previous coach always used to say is that he thought it was a pity that there's one opening in chess that's named after the Netherlands, which is the Dutch, and then we get assigned with the move 1f5, which is one of the worst openings out there. So he wasn't very happy about that, but it's not as bad as you would think. There are definitely better openings, but it's very, very practical opening, and I think very playable. And after white castles, black plays bishop d6. Here it makes a lot of sense to play b3, this plan I talked about, trying to get in bishop a3. So the question is, what should black do right now? And I think the most common move, and the move that makes the most sense actually, is the move queen to e7. And with this move, black slightly improves the piece. The queen is slightly more active on e7, but mainly we're trying to avoid bishop a3. So now with the bishop a3 we can simply snap it off, and we will be winning a piece because the queen protects the bishop. So we have prevented bishop a3. You can make a case for playing a4. After the move a4, we definitely cannot prevent bishop a3 because it's now protected with the rook. However, white doesn't really want to weaken the queen side so much. And after the move a5, what we'll see is that white has weakened this square a lot. And a typical plan might be, for example, to play knight a6, knight b4, or b6, bishop a6. And I think in general white doesn't really want to weaken his queen side so much. So he has played b3, but he hasn't really been able to play bishop a3. And the first game I wanted to show today was the game between Anand and Carlsen. Actually, when I saw that I was going to be giving a lecture on the Stonewall, I was immediately reminded of the recent video series on Chess24, because it is this video series by the man himself, Magnus Carlsen. So if you're a premium member on Chess24, definitely check it out. It's definitely worth it, because it's body world champion. It cannot get any better, of course. And one of the games he analyzes in this course is as well this game. Here it's free to watch, however. So I'm going to be discussing this game, and in this game Anand went 95. So as I said, we weaken the e5 square a lot, so it makes a lot of sense to put the knight here. And a typical plan would be actually to try and hold on to this square by playing, for example, knight e2, knight e3, protecting the knight once more, and maybe bringing out this bishop as well to f4. It's a bit strange though to bring the bishop to f4 while we've already played b3. Queen e7 then has been logical for black, useful move, while b3 hasn't been that logical. So it doesn't make too much sense to combine bishop f4 together with b3. So white is mainly going for knight d2, knight f3 here. Carlsen castled, makes a lot of sense. Typical for the Stonewall is that both sides actually castle kingside. And the reason why it's actually such a fun opening is that even though both sides have castled at both white and black have castled on the same side, but black is still going to try and mate white. So one thing you'll very often see is that black will try to storm with these pawns and try to simply checkmate white, while white is the one trying to get some play on the queen side with, for example, b4, b5. In this game it was a bit more different, because Carlsen played it in a more positional way. Anand went the move knight to d2 here, and Carlsen played the move a5. In general, in chess these days especially, we've understood that advancing your outside pawn, so the a and the h pawn, is in general a good idea. So it makes a lot of sense pushing the a pawn. It grabs a little bit of space, makes it more difficult to play b4 eventually for white. And one good question actually already in chat is whether or not white should be playing c5. And in general, I would say you have to be very careful about this. I don't think white wants to close the center yet, because then there's really no pressure against this center. Then it becomes even more stable than it already is. And you also have to be very careful, because the moment you play c5, you also create a weakness. So for example, in this position, if you play c5, black could take, and then go knight d7. And what we see is that both of these pawns are attacked. So black is simply winning a pawn here. White could have done this earlier on as well, of course. So for example, in this position, he could have also played the move c5. But again, I don't think it makes too much sense, because now it's simply very difficult to get a knight to e5. If you play knight e5, again we take, and these pawns get weak, like this. So you can play c5, but I don't think it makes too much sense, because, or very early on you don't really want to do it, because it can create a weakness. And the moment you put the pawn on c5 as well, because there's no pressure on the center, it's a lot easier for black to go for the e5 break actually. Because if without c5, if black would be pushing for, so let's say we push e5 here, or let's start with the move knight e7 for example. He plays a random move like knight e2. We don't really want to go e5, because the moment we go e5, we allow, for example, c takes d5, c takes d5, d takes e5, and now we're left with this isolated pawn on d5. So we don't really want to go for the e5 push too soon, because it leaves us with a very weak structure. The moment, however, white plays c5, we are more inclined to do this, because then the moment we go e5, not only can you not take on d5 and create this isolated pawn, but also the c5 pawn can become weak, because the defender of d4 has been is gone at that moment, and we simply create this weakness on c5. So white doesn't really want to play this move too early on. What's the correct position for white to take an e5 break? Yeah, so one more typical plan I would like to explain before I go into the game too far is the plan of breaking up the center completely. So one thing white could aim for in these positions is eventually to go f3 followed by e4 and then completely opening up the center. And in general, white would like to do this because, as I said, he has slightly more space, so it makes sense to open up the center as well, gain even more space by putting another pawn in the center, and it opens up a lot of files. Well, black is the one trying to keep the position closed by putting his pawns like this in the center. He's trying to keep the position closed as much as possible, so it makes sense to try and break it open for white because it's something black is trying to avoid. So f3, e4 is something white could aim for, but for example in this position it's not really great. I think for example after f3 the typical break move in the Stonewall can be played, which is the move c5. And as you can see, the situation in the center is becoming very unstable. So before white can ever push f3, e4, white should first try to stabilize the center and then push for this break. I think this opening is mainly strategical, so not very dynamic. We keep a very close center, so the opening is mainly strategical. However, at some point the opening can become very dynamic because at some point black is going for this kingside attack, and the moment we try to start checkmating white, white is also trying to gain his own play along the queen side. So even though it's strategical at first, eventually it might become very dynamic because it becomes a race who gets his own play first. So it can also become a very dynamic opening, but it starts being very strategical and very solid. So let's go into the game. a5 is played, gaining space, bishop b2. And here Carlsen wanted to put pressure on the knight in e5, makes a lot of sense, so he played the move knight to d7. We keep on having this problem with this bishop though. So the question is, how do we how do we play on? How do we keep on improving our pieces? And the idea that Carlsen had in mind was to put the knight to e4, the other knight to f6, and kind of follow this same strategy that white is doing. So white had this strategy of playing knight d2, knight f3, and he already put his knight to e5. And we are also doing this strategy on our own. We put the knight in e4, put the other knight to f6, and then this bishop f3 to develop again, maybe to d7, e8, or maybe eventually even to b6, b7, bishop b7. However, I would like to say though that with this knight in e5, it's always kind of difficult to go b6 because the knight's always putting pressure on the pawn on c6. So we need to keep the pawn on c6 protected. So white plays queen c2, a4 happened. Not yet going for this knight e4 plan, but it makes a lot of sense as well. Gaining more space, pushing this outside pawn even further. In general, you want to push your outside pawns as further up the board as possible, so a4 makes sense. White doesn't really want to take because it leaves his pawn structure very weak. Eventually, black will be able to take back on a4. Even if he is not able to, it doesn't matter too much that he's down a pawn because the pawn structure has been ruined and the two a pawns have both been now isolated, so it's not really a move white wants to make. Knight to f3 happened following this strategy, and now Carlsen does go for knight e4. e3 happened, and actually this idea of a4, a5, a4 wasn't only to take on b3, opening up this a file, but it was also because eventually maybe the move a3 might be an idea. Now that bishop c3 is not really possible because black is likely to take the bishop, which would be a nice trade, winning a bishop for a knight. Basically means that a3 makes a lot of sense because you also don't really like to go bishop c1. The moment white, for example, goes bishop c1, black can already start pushing on the king side to move g5 and already start this attack that he's been wanting to get. And it's really not so clear where white's play is, while black is already getting close to attacking the white king. So this would be nice. Bishop c3 was played. Carlsen didn't take on c3, however. I think it would be a good move, actually, to take the bishop. Carlsen didn't want to. I think he mainly wanted to keep the pieces on the board. Tried to keep as many winning chances alive as possible. So he went, and he went for another trade. He went for the move knight takes e5. And the reason why he went for the move knight takes e5 was to get rid of these knights, so that he can finally develop this bishop. It's clear that he cannot go for this b6 plan anymore, because there's this constant pressure on the pawn on c6. So he goes for the move bishop d7 instead. What about being b5, bishop b6 is of a4? Yeah, so eccentric, it's very difficult to do this, to play a4. Because the moment you push this pawn to either b6 or b5, white can always take on c6. So it's very difficult to play either b6 or b5 with the knight on e5, putting pressure on c6. So he develops his bishop in this way. And now I think Anand more or less makes a mistake, actually. A strategical mistake. He takes the bishop. I think this is more or less a mistake because of two reasons. One is that white is not really wanting to exchange too many minor pieces. And the other is that he exchanges his nice knight on e5, for this bishop, which wasn't too great. The bishop was about to go to e8 and h5, becoming active, but I think it's not such a great plan. I think a much better move is actually bishop e1 back, and the reason for that is because white wants to keep the minor piece on the board. He keeps his dark squared bishop as well, and not allowing it to be traded for a knight. You don't really want to lose the bishop pair, so I think bishop e1 would have made most sense. So knight takes d7 happened, queen takes d7, and now Anand went for c5. Interesting move. I think it's now not such a big deal. The thing is that Anand wanted to start creating play. Black is basically ready to go g5 followed by the f4 break, or maybe h5, h4. So black is ready to start the kingside attack, and white has to create his own play. So he went c5 followed by b4, trying to go b5 as quickly as possible and opening up this b file. Another idea was that it makes the a3 pawn quite weak, because it's not protected with the bishop anymore. So the a3 pawn could become weak, but it's not so easy. It's still protected by the rook, and it's not that easy to attack at all. So it's not really such a big deal. So b4 happened, and now Carlsen went for the attack. He went h5, trying to go h4, trying to open up this h file. Bishop e1 happened, not allowing this exchange anymore. But there was one thing the bishop was doing on c3, which was targeting the e5 square. And the moment there's no pressure on e5 anymore, black can go for this break. And this was one thing I talked about before, is the moment that white pushes c5, it becomes a lot easier to go e5. Because if the pawn were still on c4, he could take on d5, c takes d5, followed by d takes e5, and we would be left with this isolated d pawn. But now he can take, but because he's not able to take on d5 as well, we actually have a very strong pawn on d5 instead of a weak pawn on d5. So actually, it's been great for black that that white has closed the center with c5. So that's quite nice to see. Well, one of the reasons why white doesn't want to exchange this knight for the bishop is that white has a little bit more space in general in these Stonewall positions. And the more pieces get exchanged, especially the minor pieces, it's a lot easier to move around the other pieces. So if you have a look, for example, at this position, very typical Stonewall position, we can see that black is mainly putting his pieces on the third or the 6th and the 7th rank. We do have this e4 square, but apart from the e4 square, we do not have too many squares to put our pieces. So if we do not have a lot of squares for our pieces, if you have a look, for example, at the white position, he has loads of squares for his pieces, more than black has at least. So if you have less square for your pieces, you should be trying to exchange them to open up space for the others. So for example, the moment we got rid of this knight to d7, we immediately open up the square for the bishop. So we should be trying to exchange minor pieces. So this trade happened. Carlsen got it in the e5 break. D takes e5, bishop takes e5, rook d1. And now Anand does have the bishop pair, which I think is the main upside of his position. And one thing you should be trying to do when you have the bishop pair is open up the center. So it's already clear that Anand is going for the f3, e4 break. So he's trying to get an e4 as soon as possible. Carlsen saw this coming, of course. This is one reason why he put the rook on the d file, because if he gets an e4, then the d5 pawn is pinned. So Carlsen went out of this pin. f3 happened, knight f6. And Anand is not really ready to go e4 yet. At the very least, you can, for example, just exchange everything. And we get rid of this light squared bishop. And black would be very happy here, probably. So instead, Anand prepared the e4 break with the move bishop h3, pinning this f5 pawn, so that after e4, he cannot ever take with the f pawn. So this increases the pressure and makes it more easy for Anand to go for e4. Carlsen saw something sneaky, however. He saw that, well, first of all, we also need to do something in general about this f5 pawn, because it's already being attacked twice. And it's only being defended once, so we really gotta protect it. So he plays the move g6. But we do allow the move e4. And now the question is, how do we answer this? So, and I think Carlsen did it actually in a very interesting way. One way to play here is to play the move d takes e4. You cannot really go f takes e4, and you have to do something. E takes f5 is coming. And the reason why he wants to go d takes e4 as well is that he's opening up this diagonal for the queen. So the idea that Carlsen had in mind was actually play bishop b2. Seems a bit strange, put the bishop in kind of an awkward square, but it does cut this protection of the queen. Anand takes on f5, and now Carlsen took this a2 pawn. And this is also one of the reasons, or in general one of the reasons why you should be pushing your outside pawns as far as possible, is that the a2 pawn will become weak. And the moment you take it, you actually already have a very advanced pawn. So one very deep strategy behind pushing this a pawn was that this a3 pawn might actually become very dangerous once the a2 pawn is gone. And also the question is what happens after f takes g6, which seems to win an extra pawn. But this queen on c2 is also undefended, so this would immediately lose to the move bishop to d4 check. And then simply you can take the queen afterwards. So Anand played bishop f2, preventing that bishop d4 is with check. And now Carlsen had the time to do something about this g6 pawn. He went g5, closing down his king. And even though there are no pawns in front of the king is actually still somewhat safe, because the f, g, and h files are still closed. So it's actually very hard to go after his king. Meanwhile, what Carlsen will do is queen back to f7, and then start pushing his a pawn, and his a pawn is very close to promoting. So rook e1, queen f7 happened, rook e6, Anand is trying to gain play. Knight g4. And this is probably not too great of a move, because it opens up this 6th rank, and the rook is getting close to the king. First this exchange happened, and now we gave this check. And even though our king is somewhat weak, it's not so easy to go after it. And here Anand made the final mistake. Carlsen is more or less threatening soon to win the game with a2. So he would, for example, play bishop back to f6, followed by a2, winning the game. So Anand needs to do something very quick. And it turns out actually the move rook e6 would have held. It's a bit strange, but this was his best chance somehow. He instead thought that the sacrifice of rook d7 was working. Or I'm actually not so sure what Anand exactly missed, but he thought rook d7 was a nice move. Queen takes d7, f6, and now he's opening up this diagonal. He could have done that as well in the previous move without giving away the rook, But then we could take this rook with the queen, so you cannot really do that. So you have to first distract the queen, then go f6, opening up that diagonal. Let me draw it correctly, like this. But there's a nice move actually for Carlsen in this position. Can you, if you're watching the stream, can you try to find the best move for black in this position? So the move here is not a2, because white actually had a threat. So the threat was rook g7 check, and it's a double check. So let's say a2, rook g7, king h8, and we simply get checkmated. So it's not really what we want to play. Yeah, a2 doesn't work. Someone is saying rook h8, but it doesn't really do much about rook g7. However, Berserk seems to have found the right move. And the right move is queen to d1 check. Distracting this queen has to take, because it would check. And now we take the rook. And because we have gotten rid of this rook, and the queen is also not so close anymore to checkmating us, we're simply winning this game. Because our a pawn is still there, and it's very close to becoming a new queen. So, and we are not even down material at the moment. Queen d3 check happened, and he went king h6, making sure nothing happens to his king. And after move h4, en passant takes h3, Anand simply resigned, because this a pawn is going to become a queen, and the king is still quite safe. It's actually nothing you can do against this king. So it was a very nice Stonewall game by Carlsen, demonstrating first of all that you should not be allowing this exchange on a3 to happen. And then second of all, he didn't go for one of the main plans immediately. He showed us that you don't have to go bishop e6, bishop d7, bishop e8, bishop h5 immediately. He shows that you don't need to necessarily go b6, bishop a6. He actually goes for a different plan, which also is quite okay for black. So in this kind of Stonewall position, you can actually do a lot of different things, play it in a different way, and find one that that you like, basically. Let's go to another game. And one game I was really happy to be showing today. And also it shows one thing actually, which is that the Stonewall structure is not a structure you can only get from one f5. This game featured one d5. It was a very recent game. It was a game between Noel Studer and Richard Rapport in the Bundesliga championships of 2020. So it was very recent, about a few weeks ago. And even though, we haven't put the pawn on f5 yet, we still have the possibility to do so. So even though we played one d5, we still have this possibility to go for the Stonewall. c4 happened, e6, f3, c6, playing the triangle Slav. And it's an opening which keeps a lot of options open, because you're still very flexible with this f-pawn. So in some variations you want to go f5. On the other hand, you might want to take on c4, followed by protecting it with b5, and then b5 has already been protected with the c6 pawn. So there are some ideas behind the c6 move, this triangle Slav. And after the move knight to d2, aiming for the e4 break while also protecting this pawn, Rapport went for the move f5. And now we get into the Stonewall structure again, but not from the Dutch. So you can actually get this structure via a lot of different openings than only one f5. I would also like to show you, for example, you can get it from the Catalan. You can even start with one knight f6 and still get it. One variation I've played myself, for example, is this one against the Catalan with bishop b4 check. The idea is to drive the bishop to d2 and then go back. Bishop g2, and it seems a bit unclear yet how we're going to get the Stonewall structure. But by driving this bishop to d2, it's become a target. So after the following moves, we can go knight e4. And we're opening up the this line for the f-pawn to march to f5. And here don't really want you to take the dark squared bishop, so one thing they will often do is play bishop f4. And now we can play knight to d7. And after the move knight c3, first we go g5, creating space on the queen side because we are going f5 anyway. Bishop c1 should be played, and now f5. And now you can see the Stonewall structure again. We've already managed to put the knight on e4. We've managed to go f5, g5. Not so clear yet what white has managed meanwhile. And the bishop can move soon to d6. Not very necessary, by the way. But this is, for example, also a good example of how you can get the Stonewall structure from a very different opening than one f5. But let's go back to this Rapport game, to this position. And white went for this g3 setup. I think in general, against the Stonewall, the main setup that white should be choosing is to fianchetto the bishop on g2. I think these days we've kind of recognized or seen that the bishop is the best on g2 against this structure. And after the move g3, Rapport went for knight d7. It seems a bit strange not to start with knight f6, but actually Rapport wanted to keep the options open, because after the move knight d7, bishop g2, he went for the very creative looking knight h6. In general, you don't really want to put your knight on the a file or the h file, because it's very inactive there. But it will go to a much better square from h6. It will soon go to f7. And actually, one thing I haven't talked about yet is that a knight in f7 in these Stonewall structures is very nice. And the reason for that is also because it very often simply doesn't happen. For example, in the previous game, we've seen that the knight immediately went to f6, which is something simply very, very common. So usually, it's kind of hard to maneuver your knights to f7, because your knight's on f6. It's hard to get to f7 from f6. It cannot do, it's a knight, so it cannot really do that very easily. So something which sometimes happens in the Stonewall is that black plays knight f6. At some point he plays knight e4. And then actually a typical or a maneuver that does exist is move knight to d6 back. And then moving the knight to f7. But because the knight stayed on g8, it can in this position actually go to h6 immediately and then go to f7, which is a quicker way. And yeah, also one reason why Rapport is allowed to do this is because of this knight on d2. In general, the knight on d2 is not so great in these Stonewall positions, especially if the knight is not really able to go to e5. Here, for example, white wouldn't really like to go to e5. I think black simply takes. And in general, white doesn't really want to go for this structure. This e-pawn could become weak, for example, knight f7, attacking it. And yeah, it's not really what white wants. He's already doubled his e-pawns, and black should be okay here. So the knight's not really allowed to go to e5, which means that this knight on d2 is also kind of bad. And especially after the move knight f7, knight e5 is not even an option anymore, because it now simply loses a pawn. So this is one of the reasons why the knight's so nice on f7, is because it simply has a very nice control of the e5 square. So if we have a look at the structure again, we've put all of our pawns on the light squares, which means that we've lost the control over the dark squares. So it makes a lot of sense to try and start controlling those dark squares with our pieces instead, because we're not able to do it anymore with our pawns. So it makes a lot of sense actually to put the knight in f7, try to control the dark squares, and try to control the light squares with your pawns. In this game, white went b3. He didn't really want to castle yet because he was fearing the attack, like g5, h5 is coming, and he doesn't have a lot of play on his own. But Rapport being Rapport doesn't really care too much. He simply goes g5 anyway. White hasn't castled yet. But it's not so great to castle queenside either, because then black can start storming on the queenside, and as we have seen, white usually does castle kingside anyway. So it's kind of a bit of an early move. But why you can like the Stonewall so much is because our center is extremely stable. And because our center is extremely stable, we can do such weird things. We have basically zero development. We still have to develop the bishops. We still have to castle, move the rooks to better places. But because our center is so stable, we're allowed to do such funky stuff. So he went g5. White went e3, trying to control the light squares, or sorry, the dark squares a bit more. Trying to control this f4 square. And black played the move bishop to d6. Once more putting in a piece on a very active square, controlling the e5 square once more. Very important, trying to control the dark squares. Bishop b2 happened, trying to gain control over dark squares as well. So in general, actually, even though we put all of our pawns on light squares in these stone walls, we are fighting about the dark square control, which is seems kind of strange at first, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Because we have lost the control of the dark squares a bit, we need to take it back. And here, maybe white could soon consider to castle queenside. He has already managed to be able to do this. So Rapport goes for a5, trying to basically say to white, doesn't matter which side you castle to, I'll attack you anyway. So for example, after castles, one thing black could consider is already going b5 or simply a4. I think a4 makes a bit more sense. b5 would allow white to close it, so I think a4 makes most sense. Trying to open up this a file and trying to go for the attack. So the king is actually nowhere safe, except for maybe the center. But, so the next move made a little bit of sense, h4. And with this move h4, white gains a little bit of space on the king side, but he's also, he's trying to make black close position. Because black is likely to go g4, and after g4, it's not so easy anymore to open up files. This h pawn has been blocked, the g pawn has been blocked, f4 is not so easy with these pawns on e3, g3, and e5 is also very difficult with the pressure on d5. So it's not at all easy anymore to go for any breaks. So Rapport finished development, castles, knight e2, knight f6, trying to get the knight to e4 to a more active square, knight f4, and here Rapport improved his queen. So Rapport is now improving his pieces. As you can see, Studer has managed to install his knight on a very nice square. Because Rapport has put his pawns on light squares, the dark squares have been weakened, which does allow this knight to jump to f4. And now Studer made maybe a mistake. He thought actually, okay, I've closed the g file, I've closed the h file, blockaded on f4, so it's very safe probably to castle kingside. But Rapport had anticipated this, and he had seen that he had a very original plan here. Actually, it's not too original. It's a plan that occurs also somewhat often in the King's Indian, for example, when you can have similar positions like this. He played the move knight h8. And the reason for this is because he really wants to get rid of this blockade. He wants to be playing knight g6 and challenge this knight on g6. Also, the knight on f7 wasn't doing that much anymore. It's really difficult right now to get in the e5 break because there's so much pressure on d5, so you can't really go e5. And on the other end, white doesn't really put a knight on e5 anytime soon. He doesn't want to go to d3 because then he would be opening up for the f4 break. So he wants to keep the knight in f4, while the other knight finds it rather difficult to go to e5 because the f3 square is being guarded by the pawn. So this knight has no way to get to e5, and this knight is also blocking on the king side. So it doesn't matter too much how much control we have this e5 square. So he reroutes the knight to challenge the knight in f4. c5 happened, bishop c7, and now a3. And I think you have to be very, very careful with pushing for c5, because the moment you push for c5, as we've seen, it makes it a lot more easy to go e5. You do not have pressure anymore in the center. So I think maybe white should have actually waited with this push. Rapport continued his plan with knight g6. Yeah, so eccentric, white could have decided to keep the king in the center with, for example, let's say in this position after queen e7, he could decide to go queen e2. The king in general is not so great in the center ever. As you can see, it already opens up for ideas like b6, bishop a6, putting pressure here. And also, we can still open up the center with e5 eventually. So the king is not at all safe in the center either. So he should probably go to the king side anyway. Knight h8 happened, c5, bishop c7, a3. Trying to get in b4, trying to get play on this queen side. Knight g6 happened, which was the plan all along. And now b4. And now with this move, Studer is basically saying that he doesn't mind it too much if you take an f4, because he will go ef4, after which these two pawns really prevent the e5 break. You have this half open e file to gain play on, and it seems like there's really not a lot of play for black. And the moment black doesn't have any active play anymore, he's going to be slightly suffocated. White has basically more space. Black is this backward spawn. So if black doesn't manage to do anything active at some point, white will start pushing on the queen side, gain a lot of play over there, and black simply has to wait, which is not really great. But Rapport had seen that Studer actually shouldn't have gone for this pawn structure, because even though he has no pawn breaks, he can still open up the position. And if you have no pawn breaks, you have to do that with a piece sacrifice. So Rapport went for the move knight h5. And with this move knight h5, he's basically already indicating that he's just going to be sacrificing on f4. And by sacrificing on f4, you get rid of this g3 pawn as well, which opens up for the queen to capture on h4. So it's a very difficult situation actually for white, especially because he already knows what's coming. He already knows that you're going to be sacrificing on f4. Queen h4 is coming, and you can do nothing about it. So white actually made a mistake by going for the structure, because black does have a way to get through to the king. So rook e1 happened, knight f4, g takes f4, bishop takes f4. And Studer already saw what was coming. He was seeing queen h4, followed by queen h2, removing this bishop, and then going f4, f3, or g3. And his king's simply getting crushed very slowly but very surely. So he has to be very afraid right now. He has to do something spectacular to try and save this position, because if he doesn't, then it's going to be very difficult. So the move he actually played was the very nice looking knight to c4. And with this move, he's trying to give back the one piece, and trying to get counterplay of his own. Because if he doesn't get counterplay, he's going to get crushed on the king side slowly. So what happens if he takes? So white will take. And the idea was not actually to take back, but to open up the position, to go d5. And open up this diagonal, creating ideas of playing queen c3, trying to checkmate black. And actually, in this position, it's white who has all the fun. With all the diagonals opened, he's down 2 pawns, or he will likely be. But it's white playing for the initiative here. For example, c takes d5 seems to be a good move, but then bishop takes d5 because the e-pawn is pinned. And it becomes very, very messy. For example, queen h4 seems very attractive to play. But now white can strike back with rook e6. And this is really some situation that black would like to avoid. Black would like to get a position which white doesn't have a whole lot of play. Rapport basically ignored this with the move queen takes h4, going for his own play, going for this plan again of playing queen h2, followed by advancing his pawn as soon as possible. Knight b6 happened. And here, this is basically the move of the game actually. We haven't seen the most beautiful part of the game yet. It's still to come. With the move knight b6, not only is white threatening knight takes a8, but he's also threatening to take on c8, getting rid of the defender of the e5 pawn, and e6 pawn. Yeah, the position after white plays rook takes e6 is equal, but it's very messy. It's equal because it eventually ends in a perpetual by best play by both sides, but it's very difficult. I didn't want to get too far into that, but it's clear that black doesn't really want to allow such a situation in which white has a lot of play himself. So white has two threats by getting his knight to b6, which makes this knight c4 move even nicer because it was not only about giving away this knight, but it was also about getting it to a better square. But at this moment, Rapport struck back with the most beautiful move of this game. Maybe even the most beautiful move of the year. After this game, people were already saying that this might be the game of the year. Which is, I definitely have to show it if people are already saying that about this game. So far, black has already sacrificed a piece for 3 pawns. But now he's going to be sacrificing even more with the move e5. And it seems very, very difficult, but and very strange at first. But one thing that black achieves by playing e5 is getting rid of knight takes e8 followed by rook takes e6. So he's closing this e-file for sure. Another thing that he achieves with the move e5 is that he might go e4, completely close position, and then go f4, f3. And the third thing I would say that this move e5 achieves is that it opens up this diagonal. So very often I was already talking about going f4, f5, or sorry, f4, f3 actually. But the moment we go f4, this bishop can immediately jump to f5. So let's see what happens if white takes this rook on a8. The move that Rapport wanted to play was actually not queen h2, but it was bishop h2. Checking his king has to go to f1, and then going f4. And now we can see why e5 is so brilliant, because now this bishop can jump to f5. I think the move that makes sense here is, for example, rook takes e5. But now we continue with the plan of playing f3. Threatening to, for example, take. Then going g3, going bishop h3. A lot of attackers coming in. King will get checkmated, and I think it makes some sense to go bishop h1. But because we've played f3, we've opened up this diagonal once again, and after taking on e5, we're also threatening to take on h1. There's not really a way to defend the bishop, and if we take the bishop, it's also already checkmate. So this is a good example of how dangerous this position is for white. And after the move e5, white was thinking again that, okay, I really need to give back this knight. I really need to open up the position. If I keep the position closed, it's way too dangerous. I cannot leave it closed, because then I slowly get checkmated, as we've seen if he takes a rook, for example. So he took on d5 instead, giving back this knight, trying to get, basically trying to open up the center. He does get his bishop on d5, attacking this king. Maybe then he'll get this diagonal open. So finally, white is getting some play. So c takes d5 happened. And here, I think white made a mistake. White should have gone bishop takes d5. Probably king h8. And then d takes e5. Or no, sorry, this was also losing. It's actually already very, very difficult position right now. Maybe white actually tried to defend it in the best way possible, but in the line with bishop takes d5, king h8, d takes e5, it also looks very, very logical. And white is about to play e6 and basically win the game, because the king will likely get checkmated and this e-pawn will also storm down the board to e7. So e6 is coming, but black has a very beautiful move of playing bishop to e6. And basically blocking this e5 pawn and also driving with his bishop. Now bishop takes e6 is logical. And now again we play the move bishop h2 check, getting the bishop away, so eventually you might be able to push this pawn, but also so that after king f1 we go queen h3 check, king e2 only move, queen f3 check, king f1, and then g3. And with the mating threat of g2, this position is simply winning. So in this position, black has this beautiful move of bishop e6, stopping all the counterplay that white had, and then continuing the attack. So it was actually a very, very difficult position to hold for white. He went rook e5. I think it's the best try, actually. And now I think Rapport got a little bit greedy, perhaps. He should have maybe... Yeah, I believe his move wasn't the best, but it was very playable as well. He went bishop h2, king f1, bishop takes e5. Grabbing this exchange and still wanting to go f4, bishop f5, trying to checkmate. What about playing rook e1 before bishop e6? Isn't the rook already on e1 in that line? I'm not sure which position you were talking about, Aditya. And now he grabbed on d5 with check, so he needs to move the king. Now he grabbed the bishop. And if we start counting the material again, we'll see that black is up the exchange, but white seems to be having some compensation. Because if he does manage to go e6, he suddenly has this pass pawn, which could be very, very strong. It's quite close to promoting, and this king is very open. So if e6 followed by queen 3 happens, for example, then it will get tricky again. But Rapport played very well. He played a takes b4, opening up this a file, which finally makes this rook on a8 very active. This rook has been very, very passive on a8 for the whole game. And another thing it does is stops any queen c3 ideas. So with the pawn on b4, queen c3 is prevented forever, as long as this pawn is there. So it not only gives his own rook play, but it also stops the opponent's play. The opponent went king e2, trying to go rook h1, trying to include the rook this way, also getting rid of any checks that black might have had. And now, Rapport being Rapport, he had to play an original move. The player, Rapport, very, very original player always. And even when he's in such a position which should be technically winning, if he plays the correct moves, he's still very original, and he does it in a very original way. He plays the move rook takes a3, which is, yeah, another beautiful move, I think. It's really unexpected as well. It gives back a little bit of material. Black will always remain up at least a pawn, and the king on e2 will remain weak. So white took this exchange. As we can see, white can take on again on a3, but after a move like f4, we're still up a pawn with black, and the king is still likely to get mated. f3 is coming, and still a very, very strong attack. So instead, white went queen c3, trying to open up this diagonal with e6, trying to get some play again. But f4 happened, Rapport still continuing with his own play. Now this pawn is taken, f3 check happened, king e3. King needs to keep protecting the f2 pawn. Now queen g5 check, king d3, rook d8, and finally this king is too vulnerable. This king has been hunted down this whole game basically. As we could see in the beginning, couldn't really castle queenside. It castled kingside in the end. It wasn't safe over there. So and the king will finally see its demise basically. Queen d4 happened, and so putting so many pieces on the d file cannot be great. Bishop e6 happened, and white resigned. And it was a very, very beautiful game, I think, by Rapport. Probably, maybe even his most beautiful game ever. From his Stonewall. And he actually was showing some original ideas as well. This knight h6, knight to f7, very nice idea. And I hope it gives more of an idea of the Stonewall Dutch. Yeah, he does sacrifice this exchange with black, but he's only giving back material. So he was up the exchange, but he does give back the exchange for a pawn. So he does remain up a pawn, and he does remain his or keep his attacking chances. So it's not like he gives up that much material, and he still has his attacking chances. So I still like the move a lot, and it was simply a very, very nice game by Rapport. So to conclude this stream, I think the Stonewall is a very interesting opening. It might not be objectively the best opening out there, but I think practically speaking, it's always very playable. As you could see, even Magnus beating Anand with black from a Stonewall, so even at the very highest level, you could still play it and get good results. I would actually recommend you, if you don't really have a Chess24 premium account, to maybe get one and then have a look at the Stonewall series, video series by Magnus on Chess24, because it's simply very nice. There's not a lot of material made by the world champion explaining his thoughts and explaining his own games, and this is one where you get this chance. So try to check that series out, and I hope that series as well give you a better insight of the Stonewall Dutch. I hope you liked today's stream. I think a lot of people might actually be watching Magnus play against Anish Giri. I might still catch the end. I'm not sure if they're still playing. But I hope to see you guys next week for different subjects on